Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or wherever, whenever, or wherever this message hopefully penetrates you. I have an urgent message for America, and I pray that it reaches you, at least those of you who have to understand what is happening to you. My name is Patrick Lovell. I'm a producer, I'm an investigative journalist. Some know me from my work in The Con, which is a multi part television series where we provide a mammoth truth that the system has been hiding and making sure millions of us don't understand what we reveal. This would be like a movie if I actually thought anybody would watch it, but I'm taking this opportunity to try to speak to you directly and to try to connect with you because we've got to somehow find the magic key to unlock your mind in this massive noise of misinformation and disinformation that has had us all over the map, except focusing on where the actual problem is. A couple of things that set me off to compel me to do this recently is my colleagues and I have been on a 13-year mission, quite frankly, a quest to try to discover the truth of what actually happened to us in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And many of you might think that's ancient history, but it's not. What didn't happen in the aftermath of the great financial crisis is what's created the world that we all live in right now. And it's a corrupt world. It's a corrupt world in which the power is literally doing everything that is the antithesis of what we all think the United States is. We've all been taught that the country operates by the rule of law, where no one is above the law. We all believe in a free market system. We all believe that we all have an opportunity for fairness, to become successful, and we see examples of it all the time. So, unless you've actually been devastated in one form or another, whether it might be student loans, whether it might be having lost your house to foreclosure, maybe medical foreclosure, a whole number of other situations that I think many of us are cognizant of, until it happens to us, it's really hard for us to actually care. But that's got to end. There's way too many of us that have been betrayed, sabotaged, and destroyed. I am one of you. I'm just a regular guy, man. I like rock and roll. I like surfing. I like snowboarding. I love football. I love all sports. I'm just kind of like the rest of us, right? And I'm just a working fool, stiff, I should say, who cares deeply about his family. I believe in a higher power. I believe that those of us who have been taught the right ways of the world understand that integrity and dignity and liberty and justice for all should be what we all strive for and should be how our country operates above all else. But I'm here to tell you it's all a myth and it's all a lie, and you all know it. But unfortunately, you just don't understand the details of what happened to create the world that we live in. Now, a couple of things set me off recently to compel me to try to make this video to reach you, but um, uh, it's just remarkable what a mess we're in. The wheels have fallen off. It's a train wreck, and to mix metaphors, it's an emergency, and people are running for the exits. And when they do that throughout history, people tend to kind of bunch in their tribes. And we all have seen from everything from MAGA to Black Lives Matter, and everything in between and how it all plays out in media, that we are getting more and more polarized and more viciously angry at the other, when we don't understand that we're all getting played by a system of outright criminal rot and corruption that is based on deception and has betrayed everything the United States has been engineered to be. So I started ultimately from a place where I believe in the American dream. I believe in the dignity and the integrity of systems. I believed in professionals that worked within the system that would make sure that what ultimately we had to discover ourselves would never happen. But after the great financial crisis, after I had my world completely devastated by a loss to a foreclosure at a time where my income got devastated because of the great financial crisis, I started to ask questions because it didn't make sense. We all began to see things at that time period that seemed to be a contradiction of really what we were all experiencing. And by that shared experience, I began to ask questions, and we went on an amazing 13-year odyssey to where we literally found everything that we were looking for and so much more. The way it happened ultimately was I lost my house to foreclosure. In the aftermath, I don't know, I went through phases of, suicide. I didn't attempt suicide. I certainly thought about it, but my life wiped out. I had to rearrange, how I was approaching things for survival. But I was a producer, and I have been for a long time. And I went to somebody in my community who was a man of great means, and his family had come up in previous generations, were the epitome of the American dream. And I had said to him, look, I don't know what's collapsed the American dream. I don't know what's collapsed American opportunity and dynamism and all of those things that we once believed in. But I really want to go find out what the hell is happening. And I remember, and it's just an amazing framing on his behalf. He said, look, if you can figure out how we went from of, by, and for the people to of, by, and for the corporation, I'll give you that chance. And that began our journey. And my colleague then, Eric Vaughn, who was the director of the con, and I, who had been working together before, started to go on this journey. And I'll never forget that prior to that, Eric had said things to me such as that, dude, you're Captain Ahab and you're searching for the white whale. Be careful what you're looking for. And that's where I am this many years later, 13 years later. I'm at the end of my rope. I feel like I'm in a rat maze in quicksand with all the walls coming in. And it's impossible to penetrate, but I've got to find that magic key to unlock your mind, to understand that we found the answers we all have to understand, to collectively come together and rally around each other, to thrust forward, to purge the corruption that is literally killing us all. I don't want to get in the weeds on conversations about 9/11 and some of the other things that people go off on in conspiracy land and everything else, but I can tell you from 9/11 forward through the 2008 great financial crisis to everything that's happened from 2019 on, there is a continuity of a power structure that has worked its magic to literally, and it's a dark magic, it's a dark arts, literally hijacked the systems in our institutions to be able to ultimately enable a massive, massive criminal racket that has learned how to use the levers of power by influencing through the revolving door, by dangling a lot of money out for professionals that would otherwise be able to hold this criminal capacity to account, but instead has found complicity within both political machinations and the people in the systems themselves that are literally tasked to regulate the power of finance and other industries, particularly in fossil fuel and pharmaceutical and military industrial, and some of that's another story, but to create within the system, using the legal framework and white shoe law firms, big influential white shoe law firms, to where what they have done is they've created this unbelievable murkiness and separation between the people who are supposed to operate within a system of a legal framework where we're all held accountable under the law, as well as what we think is entrepreneurialism or capitalism or some sort of free market in which we all have a fair shot to be successful in our endeavors if, of course, we're successful enough to be able to triumph, as we've seen examples throughout, really the glorious part of American history, in contrast to really the dark side, the underbelly, that really constitutes what I think has always been kind of a wrestling match between the forces of good and evil. And that's really what it comes down to. In this particular era, and what took place after the great financial crisis, is what we explore in the con is that it was a completely criminal racket, starting at the bottom through what we call liar's loans. Tens of millions of loans were used to set people up, a majority of whom actually owned their houses or had a lot of equity in their houses, but because the economy was stagnant, because people needed money to live in an inflated society where goods and services and other things were kind of out of reach, the only thing that was increasing was the asset value of their home. And this could be used to leverage to lend against the equity in your home, to refinance your house, to get the cash out to deal with, if you were elderly, things like dealing with, healthcare issues, or, possibly a vacation, or possibly any number of items that people had no longer had the ability to maintain because their money was basically stagnant at that time, especially if you were living on fixed income. So as a result of this, the industry itself began targeting literally the most vulnerable in our society. It started with African American widows. Can you imagine a more deplorable, diabolical machine of deception than trying to find widows of couples that were part of the Great Migration that came out of a previous era of literal, again, betrayal to the ideals of the American system through Jim Crow, which led to the Great Migration, which led to these African Americans relocating in places like the industrial powerhouses during the World War II, where they were able to work in factories, make more money than they ever did in the agrarian South. And as a result, tens of thousands of these types of couples were able to purchase homes in places like Cleveland and Akron, Ohio, and other places in the great Midwest, especially when we had a great industrial base that fostered this sort of economy. And so in this particular case, decades later, after a lot of the times the men who were the breadwinners, owned their homes outright and they passed on, the women inherited these houses, but they were on a fixed income. And then they started to have problems with their roofs. They had problems with their health care. And lo and behold, somebody knocks at the door and says something along the lines of, this is how much your house is worth, and this is what we can do to provide you money now to handle all of the challenges that you're now dealing with. And that allowed for an unbelievable setup. Now, it would be one thing if it ended there, but it ended up grasping the entire country. And an entire country through these incredibly diabolical liar's loans, which a lot of people seem to think to this day were legal. Now, parts of them were legal under specific constructs, but the way they were used was to create deceptive acts and practices which were against there were civil rights violations and felonies across the country based on unfair, deceptive acts and practices that we would all expect our country would have in place to be able to protect consumers and homeowners, just based on common sense. You don't lie to somebody to be able to steal their houses. You don't sell somebody a car that has faulty brakes so that they blow up so that the person selling that car could collect on the insurance, for example. That's exactly what happened in the housing industry. Take that a step further. What if we all got on a plane tomorrow going to go visit our Aunt Margie in Indianapolis, Indiana, and then we went down in flames, and then we found out that was by design? That's what the great financial crisis was all about. We were all set up. We were all set up, and when it all fell apart, because it was a humongous global catastrophe, because the liar loans were on top of lending malpractice, that were on top of appraisal malpractice, actually got that flip-flop, but then into credit rating agencies, all of the systems of stopgaps that were set in place to protect investors and to protect the credibility of the system all went out the window, because in the time period of 2002, after 9/11, the society stagnated because of what happened with the wars in the Middle East. And the Federal Reserve and the Bush administration pulled out all the stops to create this housing bubble. And as a result, all of these malpractices were involved every step of the way that ultimately would trigger a global collapse that started in really March of 2007 with the collapse of Bear Stearns, and then ultimately what most people understand and recognize is the collapse of the 2008 crisis in September of 2008 when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. As a result of this massive calamity, the United States government was in transition. We went from the Bush administration to a populist wave that then President Barack Obama rode on the crest of change we can believe in. There was a FDR moment, and I hope that's not lost on you, because what you need to understand what that means was we had another period in American history that was very similar to what took place in 2008. Prior to 19, well, I'll start in 1929, but that is known as the day of the great stock market crash that led to this global calamity and this great upheaval that led to the Great Depression that would then, of course, ultimately lead to World War II. In the aftermath of that horrific global event, many things took place, right? You had, on one side of the equation, the growth of fascism, and then on the other side of the equation, you had the growth of communism, both that played out obviously in what became Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia. But in the United States, FDR came in and is well known to have said, we saved capitalism from itself. And ultimately what they did was there was a transition period in 1933, prior to FDR coming on board, where there was already in play an investigation by the United States government led by an Italian immigrant, a Sicilian immigrant, that spearheaded a congressional inquiry into why the Great Depression happened. The gentleman's name was Ferdinand Pecora, and he was a crack prosecutor. He had understood, above all else, the mob. That's what he understood. He understood corruption. He came up through Tammany Hall, and he came from Sicily, and he understood corruption, even though he didn't understand finance. And so he got put into a position to investigate what Wall Street was doing that could have been the causation of the Great Depression. And when he looked, he investigated, and the guy was absolutely magical, but he was able to find the answers to what caused the Great Depression, which came from the CEOs on Wall Street that were selling all sorts of bad products through a whole menagerie of complicated financial instruments that could have been insider trading, that actually, for all of those who are familiar with financial products, they actually shorted the market, and almost all of the same exact parallels to what happened in 2008. Why is that important? Well, what they did was they discovered the problems. And like you would expect from American society, because this is what we've done really from the very beginning time, and I say this in context, all of those are like, yeah, well, we've also had slavery the whole time. Point taken, and you're absolutely right. But I would need to make this point first and foremost, that they looked and they found the problems and they created the answers. So what do they create? Some of the answers, they created this legal framework through an initiative called Glass-Steagall, which simply separated commercial banking from investment banking, which meant that banks, with all of its incredible information and leverage and tactics that could basically really deceive anybody who doesn't understand what their inside game is, which a lot of people refer to as the casino, ultimately have to be separate. And they created aligned interest so that investors had to have skin in the game and be on the hook for the securities that we're selling, because that's what blew up the world. And so they created the Glass-Steagall Act, and then they created the Securities and Exchange Act Commission, which is the police force that is supposed to investigate financial trades and everything that basically runs the fundamentals of our economy, which is based in capitalism. The idea that money goes to the most efficient and best practices in society, and the payoff and also risk is risk reward, because investors are supposed to be able to find best practices. For example, in our generation, things like, let's just go back to Apple, and maybe now if you're an early investor in some big companies like Tesla, or previous to that, Amazon. The idea is that we always think that somebody's going to come up with the next big thing that people can get in on the early floor, use their investments wisely to invest in operations that are going to become successful. And the payoff is you get paid on that for the rest of your life. And that's how fundamentally we create the idea and notion of retirement. It's kind of a feedback loop circle. But what we created back after the Great Depression was in 1933, we had the Securities and Exchange Act, which is to essentially police this industry. And ultimately what you need to understand is that the whole thing was predicated that Wall Street, the people putting together packages that investors invest in, whether it's big time institutional investors or it's mom and pop investors on Main Street, that they have to be selling legitimate product that they're held accountable to. It's called, it's reps and warranties. The entire system is predicated on reps and warranties. So what happened in the great financial crisis is that we had, prior to the blow up in 2008, we had what was known as deregulation. The deregulation from Reagan administration through the Bush administration through the Clinton administration ultimately created a scenario where we got the three Ds: deregulation, desupervision, decriminalization. What does that mean for you and me? It means that the guys up top can act illegally because nobody's going to stop them. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. We had an inside job of these incredibly smart, gifted analysts and legal scholars and minds and people that literally sold their soul to deceive the American people for the upside for a small sliver of the population to basically guarantee and backstop criminal activity. So a lot of people out there right now are fundamentally asking questions, particularly in media, right? You've got a lot of independent media that is asking the right questions, from Russell Brand and sometimes Joe Rogan and others, minus all the controversy. And I happen to enjoy watching Crystal Ball and Sagar and Genti and Kyle Kaliski and some of the others. And they're literally all asking the right questions. We're corrupt. How are we corrupt? But they're not getting the right answers. And what I'm trying to tell you, the American people, and the 50 million people directly that got crushed by 2008, is you were all set up. And then you were ground down in a corrupt court system that allowed illegal documentation to basically take your house that you were unwitting to. Many of you went the distance and you learned all of these incredible tricks of the trade that you then turned me on to, that I still to this day can't believe that judges would sit on the bench after tens of thousands of cases knowing that there was document fabrication that would enable servicers and foreclosure mills and all sorts of actors in this just toxic pool of hyenas that were basically able to rip people out of their houses, throw them into the netherworlds, destroy their families. We know people had committed suicide in crazy numbers. So many people ended up homeless. So many people ended up divorced. The collateral damage is incredible. I got to put this into perspective from this sort of view, right? As much as 9/11 was horrific, I mean, it was just like, my God, that thing is imprinted in my mind for the rest of my days. But when those towers collapsed and 4,000 people perished, pulverized, based on this thing that actually could have been stopped. And we never found the answers to that one too, but that's a whole nother story that led to this insanity that I'm trying to get you to understand is so important for you to find the facts that we laid out for you in the con. And ultimately, what we did was 16 million filed foreclosures. Okay, let's just say it's 10 million houses. That's 30 million people. So 30 to 50 million people directly impacted by this. That was a criminal activity. And instead of actually doing the investigation of the Department of Justice through the FBI that was all underway, and we know the good guys that actually were trying to make that happen because they're in the con, my friends, and they gave us our credibility and everything else. And, at times I'm feeling like I'm coming unhinged right now, but I'm not unhinged. I'm justifiably furious because of what's going on. What they did, it was an inside job to quell the investigation, to make sure the people never understood the details of what it is I'm telling you now and the details that are in our monumental series that's on the sidelines. It's available, and I'll tell you that information shortly, but there's so much to why you don't know the truth, right? So the Obama administration comes in. Everybody thinks this guy is the greatest, guy since anything. I was one of them. I voted for him twice. I thought that Obama was going to save the world and we were going to create the kind of new sort of beginning that the FDR administration did back in the 1920s. But instead, President Obama got to be the good guy, got to try to create this, this magical healthcare thing. That was a major problem too. But what he did was he let Wall Street get away with it. America, I need you to understand that at play at that time, we were sold that there was going to be this just giant package deal from Congress that played out in a $700 billion troubled assets relief program that was to create liquidity for Wall Street. We didn't know what that meant at the time. And there was 50 billion baked in to create what was known as the Home Affordable Modification Program to try to keep people in their houses. They did that with the Resolution Trust back after the Great Depression. That's more involved information, but what that means is the idea is that government of, by, and for the people works for the people, and the people were set up through a criminal racket, but that instead didn't lead to a massive investigation where every single CEO who was responsible for this madness, which we also identify in the con, and there's a reason and a how-to that they engineered this incredible diabolical machine, they got away with it. They got away with it completely. They got away with those 10 to 16 million filed foreclosures that created those tens of thousands of suicides, and probably I wouldn't be surprised if it's millions of homeless, and all of the other collateral damage that, in contrast, quite frankly, to 9/11 and Osama bin Laden, or if I said the Gaudis, or if I said Pablo Escobar, is tiny in comparison to what our financial system and our legal system did to the American people and the American dream. I know so many of you people out there know that the system is rigged. I know that so many of you people want to blame someone. I know people in the courts that have fought for years that know amazing details of corruption of all of the players that are inside the courts that judges are allowing, and they know how horrific this insanity is, and nobody's listening to them. I've been listening to them, and I've been trying to get their truth out there because I lived it myself, but the mainstream media doesn't want to have anything to do with it. But those same people, honestly, many of them have found refuge in Donald Trump. Now, you got to understand this, American. I'm speaking directly to you, right, America? That is insane. Donald Trump has been up to his eyeballs in this story his entire career. We all know that it's public information, look it up if you don't believe me, he settled for $25 million with predatory lending practices and Trump, his Trump business and, Trump University, right? But before that, he was involved with Trump loans, and they were predatory loans. He got in the mortgage business. Prior to that, he's been doing real estate development forever, and there's a whole host of things that are now on display, and that's really what kind of set me off and why I wanted to try to make this message to try to penetrate with you, because it's going to bring this all to you now. So Donald Trump right now is under investigation in the New York AG's office for what we call control fraud. Now, if you ask Rachel Maddow, and we have seen her all over the place recently because it's safe for Rachel Maddow on MSNBC to target Donald Trump because it's that good guy, bad guy approach. And Rachel Maddow, quite frankly, is, my interpretation of her, is the communications director for the political party, the Wall Street meritocracy, Ivy League political Democrats, and they're the ones who created most of these problems. That led to Donald Trump. But in this, he said, she said, everybody looked the wrong way, I'm going to target this guy without telling you the big story, facade, Rachel Maddow has recently been all over Donald Trump for things like he increased the square footage of his downtown condo from 10,000 square feet to 30,000 square feet. He said that it was worth somewhere in the vicinity of, $200 million versus what it found out to be by appraisers like $50 million. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, you would do that because that's the same system that undergirded the entire great financial crisis that I'm telling you about that set everybody else up. The whole thing begins, quite frankly, and ends with appraisal values. If you hyperinflate the asset values, you can loan against that. That's exactly what Donald Trump was doing in this particular case that Rachel Maddow is now all over. Rachel Maddow is also all over documentation fraud. Not in the tune of tens of millions that have affected people that wound up in the courts that got their houses looted and stolen from them, even when these servicers and these foreclosure mills do not have standing to those properties. But judges let them have it anyway because that's a whole nother back-end facade of what ultimately they can get paid off in insurance, and the Treasury of the United States is involved with that. And that's a whole nother can of wax. But that is part of this giant symphony of corruption that I'm trying to make you aware of because it is destroying everybody. Now, Rachel Maddow gets into this documentation fraud story regarding because Giuliani is involved, is apparently, documentation fraud on the electors that certify the election after, that supposedly led to the big lie, which of course, and I'm going to now lay out, I think that Donald Trump has been aware of everything that I've been telling you about forever, and it's his business model. So why wouldn't he go after and create the big lie of documentation fraud and people trying to steal the election? Because that's what that guy's been doing his entire career. All it is this is the formula, people. Lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. That's who Trump is. The guy's got nailed for 5,000 lies throughout his system. He is so up to his eyeballs in this stuff. It's incredible. In fact, I will tell you this too. In 2012, Donald Trump sued his lender, Deutsche Bank, for him being a victim of predatory lending. Donald Trump, the billionaire, president of the United States, and everything that you want to bring to that picture, literally said in court he was a victim of predatory lending. Addie Polk in the con is a victim of predatory lending. She was a 91-year-old African-American widow who got set up in this whole thing. Like I told you, she was a target of predation because she was a widow. She owned equity in her house, and she got set up on this whole thing, and the story's even worse than that. But she ended up shooting herself 5 times in the chest. She didn't die immediately. I don't know how. It's incredible. It's about 6 months later she died. But that's what this system did to people and continues to do to people, while allowing people like Donald Trump to run roughshod all around the world and make this story about everything that he's up to his eyeballs, but then blame everybody else. Put that into context, for example, versus the whole Rachel Maddow analogy versus what Tucker Carlson did recently. Tucker Carlson did this, 9-minute piece maybe. Maybe it's a little bit of an exaggeration. It was hard for me to stomach watching any of it. But he did this huge expose on the homeless of this country. And basically what he said was the homeless want to be homeless. He said the homeless want to be drug addicts. He said that the states and the cities are incentivizing the homeless to be drug addicts. And then he goes on to show how developers are creating these houses that people are trying to create, or I should say housing, for the poor souls that are living desperately on the streets and all of the stuff that comes with it, which I can't even imagine how horrific that would be, even though I was close to myself. And, this guy is blaming the victim. He's blaming the victim that's tied to the great financial crisis and all of the stuff that's happened since. So you've got on the left, supposedly, which isn't really the left, Rachel Maddow, a corporate shill for Wall Street, blaming Trump. You've got Tucker Carlson, which appears to be a shill or maybe a player for, let's call it what it is, let's bring back the Confederate States of America. I mean, that's what the guy looks like to me. Mr. I don't know what family foundation of whatever the chicken operation outfit is, Tyson Chicken, which is a huge outfit, of course, and everything that comes with that. But of course, both of these mouthpieces are paid literally millions of dollars to give you half truths to get you to hate the other guy. That's all it is. That's what our country is. All of media, by the way, just so you know, and Donald Trump knows this stuff because it's amazing how he uses it to his advantage. He talks about fake media, but here's the real story. Hedge funds and private equity funds have purchased all newspapers across the country. And they've devastated investigations to make sure what I am telling you is not heard. That's first and foremost. So then you might be asking yourself, well, but then again, why do I want to listen to Patrick Lovell? A guy who, I remind you, just happens to like rock and roll, loves his family, believes in a higher power, and above all else, believes in the dignity and the integrity of the American dream and the truth and the promise of what we all believed and grew up believing because of previous wars that got us here in order to form a more perfect union, that you hold power and corruption to account. That's what this system is designed to do, but it's doing just the opposite. We are in a downward death spiral because of the rot of corruption, because of the ownership and the convergence of, quite frankly, financial power within the legal framework of the United States. And everybody's in on it. Even the good guys, Even the good guys, whoever your good guys are, even the good guys are hiding this thing. I can tell you right now, I'm a progressive, right? I wanted so bad for the stuff that Elizabeth Warren was saying 5 years ago to come to fruition, right? What was she saying? She was basically talking about the revolving door. She was talking about corruption. What was Bernie Sanders talking about? He was talking about corruption, but they do it in platitudes, my friends. The whole, blue wave from AOC and all of these other guys. I mean, they all talk about the platitudes. They're not talking about the details. They're not talking about the details, and the details come from an investigation, come from hard work, they come from integrity, they come from real people, they come from professionals. Those were the type of people that I knew existed. I come from a family of professionals. I come from a family that is taught that dignity and integrity is all that matters, as does honesty. We live in a country of absolute theft by deception, which is a criminal enterprise. I'm going to finish up with this. So, a lot of people are circling around Fed policy right now. And the Federal Reserve of the United States is always in certain places, this mythological thing, and a lot of people don't trust it. And they thought in 1913 it was created to create this backdoor power that was connected to all of these boogeymen, and it was a rape and pillage job that was meant to basically betray liberty and justice for all. A couple of shortcuts, obviously. Many people we could talk for days and hours about that, and I hope that one day we will. But like all things, we're people, we're flawed, and there's systems, and sometimes systems work well and sometimes they don't. And typically it's because of the people who are in charge of them. Okay. So, like, for example, we say a lot of times in the con, we don't blame banks. Certainly it was the banks that are involved with this whole thing, and they're the ones who made out like bandits as a result of the whole thing. But it's really bankers that are the problem. It's the same thing with, it's not politics or it's not democracy. It's people within the system, especially those who have power. And in the Federal Reserve, it's no different. So, but the Federal Reserve is the wellspring of this whole thing, and this is where the ultimate, in my opinion, betrayal comes from, that people need to understand and wake up to. And I don't mean wake in the woke joke that's become, in a real understanding, tangible way of how the system works. Okay. The Federal Reserve, after the great financial crisis in 2009, as we were all told, the government stepped in and created $700 billion in TARP and other emergency lending apparatuses to create what they called liquidity in the system to be able to keep the financial system flowing. And most people think the figure was about $700 billion. As it turns out, it was literally, and hold on to your seats and your hat and everything else on this, but you gotta, search me out, understand what I've been trying to tell you and put out there to the American people. It was $29 trillion. I know it sounds like Austin Powers, $29 trillion, right? I got like that. $29 trillion, guys, to backstop a criminal apparatus that destroyed tens of thousands of people, including myself. $29 trillion. That's 1,000 billion and a trillion, 29 times. I think the GDP of the United States is like 25, 27 trillion. I think the NASA budget is somewhere in $600 billion. I think what am I talking about? 600 billion. It's 25 billion for NASA. I think it's 600 some odd 70 billion for the largest military in the world by magnitudes of like the top 10 countries aren't even in, our budget. That, to put that into perspective, $29 trillion, guys, to backstop a criminal racket. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, who is this guy again? Why am I listening to him? Don't I have TikTok to watch and a bunch of beautiful girls lip syncing while they're dancing, or some guy running his head into a wall after he drank a keg? I mean, maybe you have better things to do with your time. What about you who have lost everything? What about you who have been destroyed? You want to commit suicide, quite frankly, because of all the things that happen. Don't you want to rally around all of the other people that have been destroyed by the system? Don't you want to understand the truth of how the system is destroying you and everything that we are? I do. If Pablo Escobar is selling, narcotics all over the world, is it my expectation, even though he, might fund some schools and some really good people in whatever the town of Colombia that, he was operating out of, because, he used the money for some good purposes, does that make it okay that he, shouldn't be held accountable for selling illicit, drugs all over the world? In my opinion, you take fucking guys like that down, and you help people that have got drug problems. That's just another thing. But you know, the criminal apparatus you take down, okay? Same with the mob. That's why we created RICO statutes. Ironically, that's why Rudolph Giuliani was a hero in the 70s when he took out the five, crime bosses of New York through RICO, racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization statutes to basically flip the low-level people up the food chain to get the crime bosses. It's what we have in play. That's what we're supposed to do. But instead, going back to what I told you about 15 minutes ago, and I know I'm rambling on, but the bottom line is you need to understand what has happened to your country. We don't do investigations. The Department of Justice has its hands tied. You remember back in Vietnam, they said, well, we had our hands tied, so that's why we didn't win. Okay, the Department of Justice has its hands tied, as does the SEC. They don't just have their hands tied, they literally have them cuffed. In the con, we have the former director of the FBI, a Republican, who is on Fox all the time, but he is an honest guy. We don't pull punches in the ideological spectrum. What we do is we just get the truth. Chris Swecker, in my opinion, is an American hero. He put together a nationwide dragnet that was getting the low-level players in this incredible Ponzi-like scheme that was what they knew was a predatory scheme, finance scheme, to basically set everybody up in this housing Ponzi scheme. They had this thing dead to rights. In fact, Chris Swecker went on national television. He tried to make the national media aware of it. He tried to get the Bush administration to go full bore on this because he said it was going to be an economic calamity in the George Bush administration. Unsurprisingly for most of you, but you need to know the details, tied his hands. They took the budget away from white-collar crime. Of course, they had it in terrorism because at that era we're supposedly fighting terrorism, even though the Bushes were super tight with the Saudis. But is it related to domestic issues, and quite frankly, domestic terrorism, as I refer to it as? He tied the hands of the FBI. You have this thing dead to rights. And Chris Swecker tells us on camera that the most sophisticated criminals in the world are these Ivy League suits on Wall Street, and that CEOs should have gone to prison. They should have. They should have gone to prison under RICO statutes. And how do I know? Well, guess what? In the con, we found the only RICO conviction in the country that was put together by a crack team led by Attorney General Mark Dan at that time. Mark Dan had some issues himself on personal levels, and we all do. We're all flawed. But Mark Dan and the Summit County, Ohio investigation team put together a unit that sussed out this whole crime matrix that I'm expressing to you and explaining to you. And in the end, they got a RICO conviction. And by the way, the FBI was looking at what they did too. But the FBI didn't pursue it. Everybody on the inside knows what happens. There were tens of thousands of people who tried to stop this stuff from happening. Most of them, and many of them we show in the con, they literally got pushed out the door and unceremoniously shoo real American citizen with integrity and guts and fortitude and character and credibility on behalf of an American people who deserve and require that. This toxic system got so bad that all of the good guys got purged to enable this insane crime to continue unabated. And then ultimately, when the whole thing collapsed, President Obama comes in, and it looks like he's going to be the guy on the white horse. Sorry, it's kind of a fun metaphor, but he was the right guy. So you got to ask yourself, what happened to President Obama? Well, I mean, look at President Obama now. I think he and Mrs. Obama are worth north of, $140 million. The guy came in on a presidency salary. I think he was worth like $3 to $4 million. I'm just vaguely remembering stuff I may have read back in the day, and I think the president's salary is like $400,000, and you probably get fantastic benefits for the rest of your life, which most of us would be extremely happy with. But of course, the Obamas are worth $140 million now through a whole menagerie of book sales. I would think personally, if I'm reading into this, my speculation is the system itself rewarded Obama for making sure that he didn't take down the bad guys. Was it a quid pro quo? Was there conversations? We don't know that. All we can do is speculate based on what we do know. Guys like Jamie Dimon, the CEO of the largest bank in the world now, literally met at the White House 29 times, and he met personally with then Attorney General Eric Holder, which never happens, just so you know. That If you're being investigated for a crime, the guy who's in charge of that investigation does not talk to the people being investigated. That's not the way it works, but it did in this case. And Jamie Dimon got off scot-free. So to put it into perspective, I mean, I'm aware that Jamie Dimon has been in his company marked for five. I mean, he's a recidivist. 5 crimes, including RICO, literally since 2008. So going back to 2009, the Federal Reserve created liquidity to the tune of $29 trillion to backstop this monumental crime, and then ultimately Wall Street paid $250 billion that we all in the netherworld, we're like, oh, okay, they got theirs, right? Do the cost of business analysis on that, my friends. $250 billion for $29 trillion. And do you think it ended there? No, they got another 11.9 trillion in 2019, and there's all sorts of weirdness going on. And what happened with almost the same sort of degree of things that were taking shape in 2019 prior to what happened with COVID, just so you know. And then since then, we've had, so many more emergency stimuluses. And I'll go back to the very beginning on this in terms of a lot of people are circling around what the Federal Reserve is and supposed to do, but yet what it actually does. So the mandate of the Federal Reserve is that it's supposed to create full employment and wrest away inflation. And they have a whole menagerie of tools and the capacity of this incredibly powerful agency to be able to try to reach those targets under any means possible. And that's the purpose. It's supposed to create a vibrant, dynamic society that learned the lessons prior to the Great Depression. And ultimately, just as a sidebar, it is supposed to create this decentralization, because we have Federal Reserve banks all over the United States. There's 12 of them, right? And then there's the Federal Open Market Committee, and all of these, again, stopgaps. These incredibly important tools of these institutions are supposed to work on behalf of the American people, such that these calamities don't happen. And another thing, among all of these giant revelations that we reveal on the con, then Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, who came up through the system through unbelievably shoddy circumstances at best, and I could talk for hours and days about that, but he was the chief regulator of the housing market. He's the guy that could have put a kibosh on this the whole time. He was literally mandated by Congress through what was known as HOEPA statutes, Homeowner Equity Protection Act, that if he was informed by his Fed governors, for example, who might have done an investigation into knowing what was going on with these predatory loans that I had talked about, he could have just simply stopped the low interest. He could have increased high interest. That would have just done away with this practice by taking the fuel away from it. And he was informed by people that we found in the con. And so, for example, really smart people, again, in this forum, brilliant women, and there were so many smart women of all colors involved with this, as men and different genders and rights, and all faces under the spectrum of humanity, played a key role in trying to prevent this on behalf of the American people. They did. And every step of the way, this is what would have happened. So Ned Gramlich of the Philadelphia Fed gets this information from people in Ohio that know this predatory lending is happening the way it is, that are targeting the likes of widows and how they're doing it. And the whole thing is engineered. And they bring that information up through the food chain. They present it to Alan Greenspan, and Alan Greenspan tells him, stop it. So again, he didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to see it. If you don't look, you don't find. Why might Alan Greenspan not want to look? Now, I'll give you just another example of where Alan Greenspan turned up. At the end of the 2008, or during the great financial crisis, when media was all over this story and they were asking everybody and anyone, what had happened and why it had happened, Alan Greenspan said to the world, nobody could have seen it coming. Okay, are you getting it now? Are you getting it now? We've all been set up to fail by a corrupt system that is relentless and will stop at nothing to maintain this course of absolute deception and betrayal of everything we are. And I'll give you one last thought here. So after we gave $29 trillion to the people that looted their own banks, the CEOs of the Wall Street banks, through all of these horrific deceptive acts and practices, through illegal reps and warranties, that they were able to get the law, removed so that it wasn't a threat to them. Then they get the Obama administration in there that, sorry, does their bidding, and that's important to talk about right now because there's people literally acting, saying that they want to see Barack Obama nominated to the Supreme Court. Barack Obama, an African American president who came in and protected the bad guys at the expense of people he was supposed to represent, like Addie Polk. The betrayal is extraordinary. I don't even know if he's actually aware of it. I don't know what it's like to operate in a velvet, ivory tower in a way that the real world doesn't exist. I don't think I'd ever want to ever. I mean, of course I would, especially after living what I've lived through. I don't want to. It's extraordinarily wrong to even think this is even a possibility. So this is the story, and I was trying to get to the final point of this whole thing. So the Federal Reserve, their mandate is to provide full employment and low inflation. That's what keeps capitalism thriving, supposedly. What they do is they protect assets of the wealthiest amongst us. And the wealthiest amongst us, and I'm not even talking about rich people per se, I'm talking about rich institutions, like the asset managers that people are starting to ask questions about now, that there's extremely insane revelations. For example, BlackRock, Larry Fink. Who's Larry Fink? They basically run the world. They own the world. They're on the board of directors of all the major companies. They're the largest asset management company I think there is. I think Vanguard's slightly smaller. They're neck and neck in State Street, but I mean they've got like $7 trillion under asset that's global. Dealing with guys like the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund into things that are backstopping literally what I've just spent the last probably hour trying to detail for you. And ultimately, they've spent trillions of dollars to backstop this criminal racket for the tiny 1%. Let's call it the 0.0001%. I'm not against success. I believe that you've got to have a free market. I believe that you've got to have the ability for people to find answers and solutions and be ambitious and do all of those great things and find success. There's got to be a balance. There's got to be regulation. There's got to be accountability for bad guys, especially when they are so clever and they are so diabolical and they are so... I know a lot of people are probably just going greedy, right? And greed might be the fuel to make this all happen. But greed isn't illegal. Criminal activity is illegal. And that's the point of everything I'm trying to unlock your brain. I don't know if I found the magic elixir. I hope somehow I've made a breakthrough. I hope somehow that you'll listen to me. I hope that somehow you'll make your way to our work in the con. It's the most important work of our times. It's not because I'm important. I'm not important. I'm just an American citizen who has had enough. If we don't get a hold of this, there will be another disaster and another disaster and another disaster. Don't blame the victim. Don't be the victim. Find us. Rally around us, become a part of a movement to purge corruption. And the only way you can do that is if you have the facts. And the facts are in the con. And the con is available. We had to self-distribute it. It is online on Apple TV. It's on Amazon Prime. Yeah, we play with the big boys just to be able to get it out there, but we didn't get on HBO and we didn't get on Netflix, which would have been, where we belonged, considering the giant revelations of what we do and how many people have been victimized by this. But look, I'm telling you right now, the people who are in control of those huge apparatuses are the same people that we expose. That's why we're not there. I know many of you people would like to think that, hey, well, if it's so important, offer it for free. It's $2 an episode for 13 years of work that took a lot of money to get. It's a free market. I believe in the free market. $2 is nothing to pay for the $29 trillion truth. Look, I paid for Jimi Hendrix albums. I paid for Aerosmith. I paid for tickets to The Clash. I paid tickets to frickin' Snoop Dogg and Beastie Boys. And I would never, I actually snuck into quite a few of those too, if you want to know the truth. But I purchased their stuff over the years. I'll be honest with you. We're all flawed. None of us are perfect, and none of us live in, it can, if they're real, live in glass bubbles. I'm not one of them. I'm a real human being. And I do want to finish with this. I mean, I've lost everything in this pursuit of delivering you guys the truth. I've lost my family. I've lost my ability to function. I'm obsessed with this story. I know the truth. I was literally directed, acted, by somebody I deeply, deeply respect. He's been in the trenches on this kind of stuff for literally decades. And he said, Patrick, you know the story. Don't let it drive you crazy, and don't die. You have no idea how many times I wanted to give up completely. I don't mean give up necessarily by, ending my life, although I've considered that. But at the same time, there's too many people that count on me, and too many people in my circle that I love and depend on me, quite frankly. But I'm all in. I am all in. I have sacrificed everything to aggregate this truth because I am an American citizen. And really, at the end of the day, it was up to us to get these answers that I'm telling you. Please unlock your mind. Please unlock your heart. Please don't buy into lies anymore. We've discovered the truth. We've presented the truth and the kind. Once you know it, you can't unsee it. And we have to come together as a population to end this. Enough. Onwards and upwards, America. Thank you for listening.